There's a particular kind of person the world never quite knows what to do with. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that shows up on the evening news or gives speeches at town hall meetings or makes sure everyone in the room knows their opinion before the appetizers arrive. The kind I'm talking about is quieter than that. The kind that gets up before sunrise, works until the light is gone, doesn't complain much, and when they finally make a decision, they make it alone, without asking for applause or permission. The world doesn't know what to do with that kind of person. And what the world doesn't understand, the world mocks. This is a story about that. About a man the world didn't understand. About a decision nobody could explain. And about what happens when someone has enough patience to keep moving forward while everyone around them only knows how to talk. But before we get to the part that's going to surprise you, I need to tell you about the man. His name was Earl. If you enjoy stories that show how life can surprise you when no one else believes it, subscribe to the channel now. Because here, each story has a lesson that can change the way you see the world. And if you don't want to miss the ending of this story and discover what really existed in that well, activate the notification bell and stay until the end. Earl Raymond Cooper, 64 years old. Salt and pepper stubble, he never quite committed to shaving, hands that looked like they'd been carved from old wood, a slight forward lean in his posture from decades of bending over work that didn't come with a chair. He wasn't a man of easy words. He was the kind of man who answers a question with a nod when a nod is honest enough. He was born and raised in Calvary Flats, a small town in central Oklahoma that most people outside the state had never heard of, and if they had, couldn't point to on a map. One of those towns that exists on paper but feels like time decided to slow down there on purpose, or maybe just forgot to speed back up. The main road had been repaved twice in Earl's lifetime. The rest were red dirt. There was a diner, a dollar store, a feed supply shop, a small Baptist church with a marquee sign out front that hadn't been changed since the previous pastor retired, and a park with a water fountain that had been broken since the Clinton administration. Earl lived in a house on Sycamore Lane that had been in his family since before he was born. Concrete block construction, metal roof, a front porch with two mismatched chairs, a backyard with a garden that produced more tomatoes and jalapenos than any one man could eat. He lived alone. His wife, Donna, had passed 7 years ago from a stroke that came fast and didn't give either of them time to prepare. His 2 daughters had grown up, moved to Tulsa and Dallas, called on Sunday evenings, came home for Christmas. It was enough. Earl's life looked simple from the outside. But underneath that simplicity was a discipline that most people couldn't sustain for a month, let alone a lifetime. He had worked since he was 14. Started sweeping floors at the feed supply shop after school, graduated to loading and unloading trucks by 16, spent his 20s and 30s doing general construction and land clearing across the county. Not the kind of work that gets written up in the local paper, the kind of work that makes your back hurt by 40 and your hands useless for anything delicate by 50. The kind of work the town depends on and never thinks about. He kept at it through the years when his daughters were in diapers. Kept at it through the years when Donna got sick the first time, the time they caught it early and she recovered. Kept at it through the lean seasons when the construction work dried up and he took whatever came, mowing properties, hauling scrap, helping farmers with fence lines. Kept at it after Donna died and the house got very quiet and the work became the only clock he trusted. And through all of it, Earl did something that sounds almost too simple to be significant. He saved money. Not large amounts. Sometimes it was $40 a month, sometimes less. There were stretches where he saved nothing because the truck needed a repair or the roof needed patching or one of the girls needed something he wasn't going to say no to. But when the money went out, he put it back. Slow and steady, without drama, without a specific goal in mind beyond a feeling he'd had since his 20s that one day, when the right moment came, he would know what it was for. He kept the early savings in a coffee can in the cabinet above the refrigerator. Opened a savings account at the local credit union when a teller named Mrs. Holloway explained the interest, slow and patient, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Added a small CD a few years after that. Nothing complicated. Just the quiet accumulation of a man who took the long view on everything. 64 years old, nearly 50 years of work. And then the moment arrived. The property sat about 3 miles outside of town, off a gravel road that most people only used as a shortcut when the main highway backed up during harvest season. It was a flat, dry parcel, maybe 6 acres total, with scrubby brush, cracked red clay, and a scatter of limestone rocks that made it look like the land itself had given up trying. In the middle of the property, there was a well. The well had been dug sometime in the 1940s, back when the land belonged to a farming family that eventually sold off, moved away, and scattered to the point where nobody in Calvary Flats could name a living relative anymore. The property had changed hands several times over the decades, none of the owners ever doing anything with it. The most recent owner was a man in Tulsa who'd inherited it as part of an estate, didn't know what it was worth, and didn't care enough to find out. He'd listed it at a price that barely covered his trouble. The well itself was in rough shape. The stone coping around the top had partially collapsed. The wooden crossbeam that once held a pulley and bucket had rotted through and fallen in. The inside was packed with decades of accumulated debris, dead leaves, blown-in topsoil, old trash someone had dumped, a car tire that defied explanation. Nobody knew if there was water at the bottom. Nobody had checked. It was, by any reasonable measure, a hole in the ground on a piece of land that had nothing going for it. Earl visited the property on a Thursday morning. Drove out alone in his truck, parked on the gravel road, walked the whole parcel slowly, maybe 45 minutes, the way a man walks when he's reading something. He crouched down a few times, picked up rocks, turned them over in his hands. He stood at the edge of the well for a long time, looking down with the kind of attention that would have struck any passing observer as strange, given that there was nothing down there to look at. Then he drove back to town, went directly to the county recorder's office, and started the paperwork. He paid cash. Every cent he had saved over the course of his working life. In a town like Calvary Flats, that kind of thing travels fast. By the end of the week, the story had reached every corner of the county. Earl Cooper had spent his life savings on a dried-up piece of nothing with a broken-down well on it. The versions varied depending on who was telling it, but the core never changed. The old man had made a bad call. The reactions broke into 3 categories. There were those who shook their heads with genuine sadness. Old-timers who'd known Earl for decades, who understood what those savings represented, who felt a real and honest grief at watching a good man seemingly throw away the work of a lifetime. They said things like, "Bless his heart," and "I hope he knows what he's doing," in the tone of voice reserved for people who probably don't know what they're doing. There were those who laughed quietly. Younger neighbors, people at the diner, voices at the gas station. Not cruel exactly, just the reflexive amusement of people who'd found an easy story. Did you hear about Earl Cooper? And the conversation would carry itself from there. And then there was the third type. The third type was Dale. Dale Whitmore was 56 years old and had the particular confidence of a man who had inherited enough to avoid ever being truly wrong about anything that mattered. He owned Whitmore's Building Supply, the largest hardware and lumber outfit in the county, a business his father had built and Dale had expanded, mostly through luck of timing and the natural growth of the area around him. He was not a man who had started from nothing. He was not a man who fully understood that he hadn't. He was tall, broad, well-fed, the kind of man who takes up space in a room without needing to move around much. He had opinions about everything, and delivered them with the comfortable certainty of someone whose opinions had rarely cost him anything. He was not entirely unkind, but he was the type of man who laughs a beat too long at someone else's expense and calls it honesty. Dale and Earl had been neighbors in the loose sense. Their properties shared a road for over 20 years. They were not friends. They had never been enemies exactly, but there was a specific type of friction that exists between a man who has worked for everything and a man who received most of his by default. They both felt it, neither talked about it. It had always been there, low and steady, like a hum you stop noticing after a while. The story of the well gave Dale something he didn't know he'd been waiting for. It happened at Denny's Diner on a Saturday morning, which in Calvary Flats was the unofficial town meeting that nobody officially called. The round table by the window, where 6 or 7 of the regular men gathered over coffee, eggs, and whatever was worth talking about that week. Earl came in through the front door around 8, nodded to a few people, went to sit at the counter alone the way he usually did. Dale was at the round table. He waited until Earl had sat down, and then spoke at a volume carefully calibrated to carry across the room without technically being a shout. "Well, there he is, the big investor." A few chuckles, the nervous kind. Earl picked up the laminated menu he'd read 1,000 times. "Earl, I gotta ask you something seriously." Dale leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, performing ease. "You actually spent everything you had on that dried-out stretch of dirt out on County Road 7? The table was quiet. The counter was quiet. The kind of quiet that only happens when people want to hear what comes next, but don't want to look like they're listening. Earl didn't look up from the menu. "Man works his whole life," Dale continued, the smile sitting easy on his face. "Saves every nickel for 40-some years, and spends it all on a broke-down well that hasn't had water in it since before either of us was born." He paused. "You know what that tells me? That tells me some folks just weren't built for holding on to money." There was laughter this time. Not universal, but enough. Earl set the menu down. Looked over at Dale, steady and unhurried, the way a man looks at something he's made a decision about. He didn't respond. He turned back to the counter, caught the eye of the waitress, and ordered his usual. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, coffee black. The table moved on to other topics. But the words had been said out loud in a room full of people, and in a town like Calvary Flats that meant they were now part of the official record whether anyone wrote them down or not. What happened next was the part nobody could fully explain. Earl didn't argue, didn't defend himself to anyone who brought it up, didn't stop going to the diner, didn't avoid the gas station, didn't change his routine in any visible way. What he did was go to the well. Every morning, 6 days a week, sometimes 7. He'd load the bed of his truck with whatever tools the day called for: shovels, a wheelbarrow, rope, buckets, a work light that ran off a small generator, and drive out to County Road 7 and work for 3 or 4 hours before the Oklahoma heat got serious. He was cleaning out the well, slowly, methodically, the way Earl Cooper did everything, hauling up debris by hand, bucket by bucket, removing the collapsed coping stones one at a time, setting them aside in a pile he was clearly planning to use again, cutting back the overgrown brush around the perimeter so the area could breathe. People drove by, not always accidentally. The gravel road got a little more traffic than usual in those weeks. People slowed down, some stopped briefly. What they saw was an old man doing hard physical labor on a piece of land that had nothing obvious to offer. Some still shook their heads. Some felt that stubborn pity deepen into something more confused, because Earl didn't look like a man who had made a mistake. He looked like a man who was executing a plan. That distinction bothered people more than they expected. Dale heard about the daily visits from his assistant, who had driven past twice. He said nothing about it at the diner table, but he asked a few questions. Casual, offhand, the kind of questions you ask when you're pretending you're not particularly interested. Where exactly was Earl working on the well? How far down had he gotten? Was he doing it alone? He was doing it alone. 6 weeks in, on a Wednesday morning so hot, the air above the red clay shimmered like it was considering becoming something else, Earl was at the bottom of the well. He had built himself a descent rig from lumber and rope, the kind of improvised engineering that comes from a lifetime of making things work without the right equipment. He'd been working his way down for days, the debris coming up in buckets, the walls of the well slowly revealing the original limestone that had been cut by hand nearly 80 years ago. He was maybe 20 feet down. His headlamp threw a white circle on the floor of sediment below him. He worked the shovel into the packed earth at the bottom, lifted, dumped into the bucket, worked it in again. On the third push, the blade of the shovel met something different. Not rock, not hardpack. Something that gave slightly, something with yield to it. Earl stopped. He pressed the shovel in more gently this time, at the edge of the spot. He crouched down and brought the headlamp close. The dirt where he'd disturbed it was darker, not just the brown red of the surrounding clay. Darker, almost black, the kind of color that soil gets when something is moving through it from below. He pressed 2 fingers into the darkness. When he pulled them back, there was moisture on them. Clear, cold, Unmistakable. He didn't shout, didn't climb out immediately, just sat at the bottom of that well for a long time in the circle of his own lamplight, 20 feet below the dry Oklahoma surface, while the world up top kept turning and the diner filled up for breakfast and Dale Whitmore sat at his round table and the town went on being absolutely certain it knew exactly what Earl Cooper's mistake had cost him. Down in the dark, Earl pressed his palm flat against the wet earth. And the earth pressed back. He wasn't sitting at the bottom of an empty hole. He was sitting at the top of something the county hadn't seen in decades. And by the time the sun went down that Wednesday, Earl Cooper would know exactly how right he had been. The only question left was what he was going to do about it, and whether the people who laughed the loudest were ready for the answer. The moisture on Earl's fingers didn't lie. He'd worked enough land in his life to know the difference between surface damp and something rising from below. This was rising, slow and cold and deliberate, the way groundwater moves when it's been sealed off long enough and finally finds its path again. He'd felt that sensation once before, decades ago, helping a farmer dig a new well on a property east of town. The farmer's grandfather had told them exactly where to dig. They'd thought the old man was guessing. He wasn't. Earl stayed at the bottom of the well for nearly 40 minutes that morning, not working, just watching. The dark spot in the earth spread slowly outward, no bigger than a dinner plate at first, then the size of a welcome mat, the sediment turning from brick red to deep brown to almost black at the center. He climbed out, drove home, made a sandwich, and sat on the back porch for a while, looking at nothing in particular. He didn't tell anyone that day. By the following Monday, there was standing water at the bottom of the well. Not much. A few inches, pooled in the center of the excavated floor, clear enough that when Earl dropped his headlamp beam into it, he could see the reflection staring back up at him. He lowered an old tin cup on a rope, pulled it up, held it against the morning light. Clear. No smell. Colder than it had any right to be in Oklahoma in late summer. He drove to the county extension office in the next town over, walked in, and asked if there was a water quality testing kit he could purchase or borrow. The woman behind the desk, who had been working there for 30 years and had seen most things, looked at him with the measured curiosity of a person who had learned not to ask too many questions right away. She handed him a basic field test kit, wrote down the number for the State Water Resources Office, and said if his results looked interesting, he ought to give them a call. Earl thanked her, drove back out to County Road 7, collected his sample, and mailed it off that afternoon. He received the results 11 days later. He read them alone at the kitchen table under the overhead light that Donna had picked out at a hardware store 22 years ago, the one with the frosted glass shade she'd said made the room feel warmer. He read the results twice. Then he folded the paper in thirds and put it in the front pocket of his flannel shirt. Potable. High mineral content of the beneficial variety. Low contamination indicators across every measure tested. The accompanying note from the state hydrologist who had reviewed the results used the phrase notable given regional drought patterns and suggested that a full geological assessment might be warranted given the characteristics of the sample. Earl poured himself a glass of sweet tea, sat back down, and allowed himself about 10 minutes of quiet satisfaction before moving on to what came next. The town found out the way small towns always find out, not from the source, but from the ripple the source creates when it moves. Earl had called a geological consulting firm out of Oklahoma City. They sent a field technician, a young woman named Priya, who drove a white pickup with survey equipment in the back and asked questions in the specific technical shorthand of someone who had been doing this long enough to stop finding the work dramatic. She was at the property for 6 hours. She walked the full parcel 3 times. She drilled 2 small test holes with portable equipment. She measured. She cross-referenced something on a tablet with topographic data Earl didn't fully understand. She looked at the limestone composition of the well walls and asked Earl where he'd gotten the coping stones from and nodded slowly at his answer. When she was done, she stood at the edge of the well with her hands in her jacket pockets, looking at the scrubby, sun-bleached Oklahoma landscape around them. "Mr. Cooper," she said, "you're sitting above what looks like a secondary tributary of the Arbuckle-Simpson aquifer system. It's not a main channel, but it's connected. which means it doesn't rely on local rainfall to recharge. It pulls from a system that covers several counties. She let that sit for a moment. You dug down far enough to breach the caprock layer that was sealing it off. Probably cracked decades ago from surface pressure, but never fully opened. What you've got here is a consistent low-drought water source in a county where 3 of the last 6 years have seen wells go dry. Earl looked at the well for a moment. "I know," he said. Priya looked at him. "Did you know before you bought it?" "I had a strong feeling." She almost smiled. "Mind if I ask what gave you the feeling?" And Earl told her the same story he'd been carrying for over 50 years. The one he'd never had occasion to tell anyone in Calvary Flats because nobody had ever asked the right question. Earl was 11 years old when his grandfather brought him out to this stretch of land for the first time. His grandfather, Thomas Cooper, had been a water dowser, or more accurately, he'd had the specific geological knowledge that people without the vocabulary for it sometimes called dowsing. He'd grown up in an era where you learned the land by necessity, where the difference between finding water and not finding it was the difference between a working farm and a failed one. He'd spent 60 years reading soil composition, rock formation, watershed patterns, the particular way certain grasses grew and certain rock faces split, and had developed an intuition that was really just expertise that had gone quiet and absorbed itself into instinct. He'd walked Earl across this parcel on a Saturday morning, pointing things out. The way the limestone tilted here, the type of sedge grass growing in a line across the property that didn't match the rest of the surrounding flora, the color variation in the rock face on the eastern edge where the ground dropped slightly. He'd stood at the well, looked down into it, tapped the stone coping with one knuckle. "Water down there, Earl. Good water. The old folks who dug this didn't go far enough, hit hardpack and gave up. But there's a layer below that hardpack, and below that layer there's a system that doesn't care what the weather's doing up here." He'd turned and looked at Earl directly, the way old men look at the young ones they're trying to leave something in. Don't know who'll have the patience to get to it, but somebody ought to. Thomas Cooper passed away 14 months later. The land changed hands. The town moved on. Earl moved on too, outwardly. But he kept that mourning in the way you keep something you don't fully understand yet but know better than to put down. He drove past the property a dozen times over the decades. Never stopped. The time wasn't right. The money wasn't there. Life kept presenting its interruptions. Children, work, Donna, all the things that rightfully come before a theory about groundwater on a piece of land you don't own. Until the land went up for sale, and the savings were there, and Earl looked at both of those facts side by side and understood, with the quiet certainty of a man who has been waiting long enough, that the right time had finally arrived. The story spread through Calvary Flats the way the good stories do. Not in a rush, but with weight. It wasn't the same as before. The first round had moved fast and light, all laughter and head shaking. This time it moved slower and landed heavier, with the specific gravity of information that requires people to recalibrate. The word aquifer started appearing in conversations where it had never appeared before. People who had never thought about groundwater in their lives were suddenly very interested in what exactly lay below the county. A retired geology teacher who lived on the north side of town became briefly popular at the diner for the first time in years. The county's agricultural extension office reportedly received more calls in 2 weeks than they had in the previous 6 months. And in the middle of all of it, Earl kept going to the property, still early in the morning, still in his truck, still alone. But the work was different now. He wasn't excavating. He was building. He had ordered proper well casing materials, contracted a licensed well driller to come out and complete the installation to modern standards, started the process with the state for the permits and designations that would make the water source official and usable. He was methodical about it. No rushing. Same pace as everything else. Dale found out on a Tuesday. One of his employees, who had heard from his wife, who had gotten it from a friend who worked at the county extension office, came into the supply store with the story already fully assembled. He told Dale while restocking a display near the register, not even pausing to frame it as something significant. It was already common knowledge by then. Dale listened without interrupting. Then he said he needed to check something in the back and disappeared into the warehouse for a while. He stood between the shelving rows, in the particular quiet of a large building full of objects, and ran through the arithmetic that he hadn't been asked to run, but couldn't stop himself from running. The water source, the drought years, the county's ongoing trouble with agricultural wells, the value of a consistent, legally designated water supply in a region where 3 out of 6 years ran dry. He thought about the Saturday morning at the round table, the room full of people. His own voice carrying across the diner. Some folks just weren't built for holding on to money. He stood there for a while with his hands in his pockets and said nothing to anyone. He went out to County Road 7 that Friday evening, after the store closed. He hadn't planned what he was going to say. He didn't have a speech prepared. He drove out and pulled up on the gravel road, and Earl's truck was still there, which meant Earl was still working. He walked to the edge of the property. Earl was near the well, checking the new casing fitting, his back turned to the road. Earl. Earl turned around, looked at Dale without surprise, without expression, the way a man looks at something he's been half expecting. Dale! Dale walked closer, stopped about 10 feet away. Looked at the well, looked at the casing, the cleared land, the modest beginnings of what was visibly becoming something real. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, he didn't dress it up. I said things I shouldn't have said. In the diner, in front of people who didn't need to hear it. Earl watched him. I didn't know what I was looking at, and I ran my mouth anyway. Dale paused. That's on me. Earl straightened up from where he'd been crouching, dusted his hands off on his jeans. Appreciate that, Dale. I was wrong about you. You were wrong about the well, Earl said, with something in his voice that wasn't quite a correction and wasn't quite forgiveness, but landed somewhere useful between the two. You didn't know me wrong. You just looked at one thing and decided you'd seen enough. Dale took that and didn't argue with it, which was more than Earl would have predicted from him. They stood there for a while in the early evening, two men who had never been friends and weren't becoming friends now exactly, but were standing on ground that had shifted enough to make the old distance feel unnecessary. Your grandfather told you about this place? Dale asked. Earl had gathered word of the story had gotten out. Showed me, Earl said. I was 11. He pointed at everything I needed to know. Took me 50 years to get back to it. Dale looked at the well. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite regret and wasn't quite admiration, but had elements of both. What are you going to do with it? Earl looked at the horizon for a moment, the flat Oklahoma sky going orange at the far edge. I've been in talks with 3 of the farm operations east of town, the ones that went to emergency water hauling last summer when their wells dropped. He paused. And the county water authority reached out last week. Dale nodded slowly. So it's worth something. It was always worth something, Earl said. Just required someone to go get it. By the end of the following year, the Cooper Well, as it had come to be called informally around the county, was supplying supplemental water to 4 agricultural operations during dry months. Earl had worked out arrangements that gave him a modest but steady income, enough to live on comfortably and set aside a little more, the habit of a lifetime that he didn't seem able to fully break even now that the reason had changed. But the thing that Calvary Flats talked about most wasn't the water contracts. It was what Earl did with a portion of the first year's income. He donated a fund to the local high school, not a large amount, but specifically designated for a scholarship for students interested in geology, hydrology, land science. The kind of learning that his grandfather had carried without formal education and that Earl had always believed deserved better preservation than memory alone could provide. He didn't make an announcement. He told the school principal, asked that his name not be used on anything, and left. The principal told one person. That person told 2. It was Calvary Flats, after all. There's a particular kind of judgment that feels like wisdom because it comes fast and it comes confident. The kind that looks at something unfamiliar and calls it foolish before asking a single question. The kind that mistakes silence for stupidity and patience for defeat. The kind that needs an audience to feel certain, that requires a room full of people nodding along before it trusts itself. It's a loud kind of judgment. It gets the last word in a lot of rooms. It fills up diners and comment sections and side conversations with a certainty that sounds like experience, but is actually just noise. Earl Cooper never argued with it, never tried to compete with it on its own terms. He just went to work. He went to work every morning on something that looked, from the outside, like nothing, and he kept working, alone, without validation, without applause, because he knew what his grandfather had shown him, and he trusted that knowledge more than he trusted the consensus of people who hadn't bothered to look below the surface. He didn't need anyone to believe him first. He needed the work, the patience, the willingness to keep going while the verdict was still out. That's not always how the story ends. Sometimes a person has a conviction and works for years and the earth doesn't give back what they were hoping for. That's real too, and it's worth acknowledging. But sometimes the earth gives back everything. And sometimes the people who laughed the longest have to sit with the specific quiet of a man who never asked them to apologize but wouldn't have stopped them if they tried. The last time anyone reported seeing Earl out at the property, it was an early October morning, cool and clear. The Oklahoma sky doing that thing it does in autumn where the blue goes so deep it looks like something you could fall into. He was sitting on the new stone coping he'd laid himself, the work clean and solid, built to last. His truck was parked on the road. A thermos of coffee sat next to him on the ledge. He wasn't working, wasn't on the phone, wasn't doing anything that would make sense to explain, just sitting next to his well on a piece of land everyone had told him was worthless in the early morning light of a day that didn't owe him anything but was giving him something good anyway. Below him, steady and cold and indifferent to everything the county had been through, the water kept rising, the way it always had been, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. Some people see water where others see only dry ground. The difference between them isn't luck. It's what they're willing to believe before anyone else can see it yet. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and reflection purposes. All characters, locations, and events are fictional and are intended to illustrate universal themes of patience, vision, perseverance, and the cost of hasty judgment. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is entirely coincidental.